And why wouldn't she have given you a drink?
She knows that's not my beliefs.
Ah, okay, so she would have been.
If something's wrong, you know,
Yeah.
she. We did have an officer that died over there once, and it hit me hard. I don't remember his name. I went to a mobile wall, you know, the Vietnam Wall. I went to one day and I looked him up, and he's not hard to find. And I went to his name, and the minute I saw the name on the books, I knew it was him. Usually an artillery officer, a young artillery officer, spends first half of his tour in the field. And he's with a unit, and he directs artillery for him out in the field. And this guy was so good with his bush skills and that they kept him with the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese. But every time they got in contact up where we were, these guys would draw back and leave him out there alone. And several times, I remember one night going down and listening to the radio at the air section of him keeping contact with people from a mortar crater. And he was totally surrounded and fighting. And we'd tried twice before that night to get him out. And the aircraft come back like Swiss cheese, and they couldn't get to him. And I mean, we're using gunships to try and run interference for you. And we couldn't get him out. This happened on a couple occasions. He's the same one. Did they want me to relay about Ben Het again?
Yeah.
He's the same one that I was up by Dak To, and we had a staging field between Dak To and Ben Het for what we called FOB missions, flights over the border. We also had a more colorful term for it, but anyway, we would stage there for going over, and Ben Het was right at the tri-border area where Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam come together. And it was a strategic, military strategic location. He was down by the staging field, and he's looking at all this stuff stacked up. And he asked, "What's it doing here?" And he says, "Well, it's supposed to go to Ben Het." "Well, why isn't it at Ben Het?" And being out in the field, you're just disconnected from anything and everything. He didn't know they'd been under siege for months. And they'd been under siege to the point to where we couldn't get anything in or out. We dropped rations on the runway at one point with a C-130. It got so shot up that the wings fell off it before it got back to base. The rations that were dropped were what we call a low-level extraction. They come across the field, they throw a parachute out, the stuff's dragged out the back and dropped on the runway. They couldn't get the stuff off the runway. It rotted on the runway. They loaded up a tank retriever, and a tank retriever is bigger than a tank, and it's more armored. It's got a 12-cylinder diesel engine, and I forget how much horsepower it's got, but it's unbelievable. And this thing can fasten to a tank and drag a tank off the battlefield with no treads. Because that's a common thing to have happen, have a track get blown off a tank, and then it's immobile. It's a sitting pillbox, if you will. And this thing would go out and fasten to that tank and drag it off a battlefield. It's a pretty substantial piece of hardware. They let one of them get right in the gate going into Ben Het and then blew it up. Nothing got in or out of that place, nothing. Well, he takes a look at all these supplies and he says, "Well, we can't have that." He wanders off and he comes back later and he got a Jeep from somewhere. I have no idea where he got it from. And he just puts a bunch of whole supplies on the Jeep. Well, they need this, they need that, they need this. And all he's got is M16. And it's leaning against the dash. And he takes off. He drove all the way down to Ben Het, down the road that goes, one road goes there, drove down, drove around the tank retriever and into the base, delivers the supplies. And they go, "Well, we'll find you a place to stay. You know, we're going to stay. I've got to go on patrol tomorrow." He jumped back in the Jeep and drove all the way back. Nobody even shot at him.
Right.
And the only thing I can assume is some things happen in combat. It's like counting coup. And they happen from time to time, and when you see them, you just sort of stand there and go,
Right. Yeah, I think we did have that particular piece of story in the previous round. But this is a fellow who would go off, and he would go across into Laos or into Cambodia as part of what he would do.
He was typically working with just the Vietnamese on our side.
Okay.
And one night, they left him. And for a while we had contact, and for a while we were trying to get at him, but he was in a heavy jungle over there. Can get triple canopy. And I don't know if people here know what I'm talking about, but the trees will grow up and they'll make a complete canopy, and then they'll grow up and they'll make another complete canopy, and they'll grow up and they'll make another, and they get so thick that we've had aircraft that have had extreme difficulty have landed in the top of the canopy and stayed there. I don't know if you can imagine it. And then they drop a 160-foot rope that we sometimes use where the guys rappel out, or we do string jobs across the border to pick people out. And they've rappelled down and not been able to get to the ground yet. Just amazing. Anyway, he was in one of those kind of areas. We couldn't fly in to get him. We couldn't, it was difficult doing anything. Then battery runs out. You run out of contact with them. I don't remember now whether it was days or weeks later, but they found him alongside the Maid Road, and they had broken his arms and bent him around and nailed his arms to the tree. Don't know if that was before he was dead or after he was dead. His privates were cut off and they were stuffed in his mouth. Don't know if he bled to death or suffocated, but he didn't go easy. And I went down to the bunker that was behind my hooch and threw open the door, and it's the first time there wasn't a bit of liquor in there. And I went up to the officers club, and I was intent. I was having a hard time with that one. And I came in, and I don't remember the gal who ran the bar for me, but she popped a knee-high orange and just slid it down the bar. And that sort of short-circuited me. And she somewhat saved me, because I was going to tie one on. He was way past his 6 months. Why they kept him out there, I don't know. I know the commander from that unit. I don't think he's the type to hold a grudge. I don't know if they had nobody else to put out there, and he was the best skilled. So you put him out there figuring he's less likely to get, don't know. I mean, I think I told you before I was covering the convoy and the convoy stopped. He ran into the jungle and I'm looking going, what? And I'm flying convoy cover. And I'm going, what's going on down there? Because he went into the jungle all by his lonesome. He come out later and he threw something in the back of the Jeep. And of course I'm 1,000 feet over the top of the convoy. I can't tell precisely what he did, but he threw something back of the Jeep. I've got pictures at home of him standing in front of the mess hall with the gals you're talking about. And he's got a snake that was about this big around. He's holding with both arms like this, and the thing's just barely touching the ground on both sides. He'd shot it behind the head twice with his .45 and brought it back and put it in the Jeep and brought it back. I don't know. That was something that was important to him. But you get a little loose. I mean, you've been in combat long enough. When you first there, you're scared to death. And after a while, you just do. And he felt safe enough, I guess, at the time with the situation. He just went and got the snake.
Yeah. And you talked about him staying out in the field. It may be that he wanted to be in the field.
I don't know. If he'd been one of my men and I had the men to spare, I don't care if he wants to or not. He'd done his time.
Right.
And you can play the numbers. And that's exactly what I talk about at times. You can play the numbers, and if you play them long enough, your number's up. And you can get away with anything for a while. You know, there's old pilots and there's bold pilots, but there's no old, bold pilots.
Okay. Now,